Hello, and thank you for having me here today. My name is Lydia O'Meara, and I'm a nutrition scientist and a third-year PhD student with the Natural Resources Institute. My supervisors are Dr. Kate Wellard, Dr. Paula Dominguez-Salas, and Dr. Elaine Ferguson. Today, I will be sharing some preliminary results from my PhD, in particular on our conceptual framework of food environments for women in low and middle income countries, which is based on a systematic scoping review. So by way of background, we're all aware that women carry a disproportionate prevalence of malnutrition, which is often due to heightened nutritional requirements during the reproductive years, such as pregnancy and lactation. The food environment is the interface where consumers procure food from the wider food environment. And a lot of these concepts relating to food environments in LMICs have been evolving over the last 5 years. However, little is known still about the characteristics that may be unique to women. So the purpose of this study was to identify and map the characteristics of the food environments that influence women's food acquisition practices and their dietary intake. The purpose of this is to help refine more effective food environment conceptual frameworks to help guide research and key entry points for nutrition interventions. As you can see here on the HLPE food system framework, this study is really concentrating on these two elements in the middle, which is consumer behavior and dietary intake, which is often termed the missing middle. By way of methods, this is a scoping review. We systematically searched 21 databases across 3 platforms, namely Web of Science, Core Collection, EBSCOhost, and PubMed. We were looking for articles that were peer-reviewed, published from January 2010 onwards, either in English, Spanish, Portuguese, or French. And everything was done in duplicate, all the screening and data extraction, and we used all free software. We used Mendeley to handle our references and Google Forms for all of our screening and data extraction. The protocol is published, which you can access here on JBI Evidence Synthesis. So Prisma flowcharts are always overwhelming, so I'll just quickly point out the key elements here to be aware of. That is that we started with over 2,000 records for screening, and at the end of the day, we ended up with 316 for inclusion. Most of those were in English, with a handful in Spanish, Portuguese, and French. So let's pop this all in a little bit of context. So for the 316 studies that we have included, we found that nearly 80% of them only looked at non-pregnant or non-lactating women, or more importantly, the physiological status of the woman was not specified, so it wasn't collected. 26% did identify pregnant women, and a very small percentage identified 14% as lactating, which we know is quite surprising because we know that a large portion of women in LMICs are breastfeeding at any one time, and they have heightened nutritional requirements during that period. Most of the studies were quantitative, with a smaller portion being qualitative or mixed methods. 45% looked at food acquisition, so not as many studies as we would like. And overwhelmingly, the majority looked at dietary intake. That's 93%. So here you can see the geographical distribution of the studies with a nice spread across the LMICs. However, most of them were from middle-income countries here, and most of those were very much from Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and South Asia, which is what we would expect, but a much lesser percentage coming out of East Asia or the Pacific. So what did we find in way of food environment drivers? So at the bigger picture level, so the national, regional, and institutional levels, we found the usual suspects that have been identified in other frameworks. So that reinforces those findings regarding food availability, vendor and product properties, stability and sustainability, which is that strong cross-cutting theme, food prices, and marketing and regulation. But what we were able to really tease out is all the different food sources that women draw on, whether that be wild, cultivated, informal markets, formal markets, food aid or national feeding programs, and social exchange or gifts. Where it really started to shine is where we were able to help refine those household and personal level drivers. And that very much covered food literacy or educational nutrition knowledge, affordability, physical accessibility, food preferences, women's agency and autonomy, which we'll come to a little bit more later, social and cultural forces, food security, which is cross-cutting, convenience and time use, social capital or networks, and food safety perspectives. And I will just tease out this one on women's personal agency. The strong themes that were coming through on this related to her decision-making autonomy, financial autonomy, her social capital or networks that she could draw on for food procurement, her time use, and her mobility. So the one that everyone's been waiting for, this is our draft conceptual framework. This is still in its early days, so I really value everyone's input and feedback on this, especially regards to the intuition of it. Does it make sense? What would you want more clarification on? What things do you think just really are not in the right place? I really, really value that feedback at this point because this is a really iterative stage where we can adjust. So for those that are familiar with some of the existing food environment frameworks, you'll notice that this one is very much built on the onion layers of the social ecological frameworks. So starting from the outside with that stability and sustainability, which is very much a foundational cross-cutting theme, moving in then to the external or the built food environment. So that's where the food comes in from the food supply chains and is available on sale for what prices, regulated by different policies and markets. And then we move on to the middle layer, which is that household food environment of physical access and affordability, household food preferences, and social and cultural forces. And then lastly, the individual women's personal food environment and what she ultimately has the autonomy or agency to then procure and then eat. And we found that these elements, these circles of personal agency and household food security were very much bottleneck mediators of these elements. So in conclusion, over the last 10 years, we found that there's little to no research on women in LMICs using explicit food environment frameworks, which has resulted in a lack of consistency and standardization in methods and metrics. To date, the majority of the research is quantitative, based in middle-income countries on non-pregnant or non-lactating women, which have the lower nutritional requirements, and very much on dietary intake, and that being dietary diversity scores. This leaves large research gaps relating to a need for more explicit food environment research so that we can compare results between countries and regions, especially using mixed methods. We need a focus on pregnant and lactating women, food acquisition practices, that interface or that real missing middle, and more on quantified macro and micronutrient intakes, especially in those very underrepresented regions or countries that are low income. From a conceptual framework perspective, we found that this review was really helpful in refining those household and individual level food environment drivers. In particular, we found that women's personal agency and autonomy was a key bottleneck mediator of what food she could procure and what food she ultimately ate. So this, of course, has a knock-on effect to her nutrition and her health status. Thank you very much for having me, and happy to take any questions. Thank you.